Good afternoon. My name is Nate D'Angona, Clinical Manager in Behavioral Health. I have a long background of being a technology geek, a lot of interest in different aspects of technology and how it affects our day-to-day lives, a lot of interest in user interfaces and how technology has affected our behavior and our wellness overall. So today, my goal is to give you a few tips on how to utilize technology to promote wellness, some of the things especially baked into our smartphones that can help us balance using the phones as a productivity tool and limiting how much they can be a distraction or interfering with our day-to-day life. So the presentation is called From Mindless to Mindful, Technology Tips to Promote Wellness. The objectives are to identify some ways in which technology may be helpful or harmful, and to implement some simple steps to mitigate technology's effects on us and to promote wellness. The smartphone is what I'm going to talk about for the most part today. It's a double-edged sword. So as we all know, smartphones can be helpful or harmful. We have unprecedented access to information. We have an ability to stay connected regardless of distance. However, at the same time, smartphones have many negative effects on us. You may have heard the quote, "Comparison is the thief of joy," by Teddy Roosevelt. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes when we talk about social media. We also have unprecedented access to misinformation and to distraction. The information that we have access to, we have to discern what's accurate, what's inaccurate, and that can be stressful in and of itself. We also have this inability to disconnect or to be truly present. The same benefits that mean we're reachable wherever we are, unfortunately means at times we're reachable wherever we are, and I think many of us have experienced that, especially in leadership. Social media and mental health. There's enough on this subject to do a doctoral dissertation. We're just going to briefly talk about some of the effects and give you a few simple things to be aware of and some tools to help reduce the impact of social media or to utilize it more beneficially. Sometimes maintaining an online presence can feel like a part-time job. We're constantly conscious of what we're putting out there, what image are we projecting. Culturally, there's a lot of focus on what folks are putting on social media. We've all seen that focus as well and how it can affect our livelihoods, our jobs, our families, things like that. So it's never been more of a minefield as far as social media, so we all have to be careful. But there's some interesting research on social media utilization, and it doesn't all point to the amount of time that we spend on social media. Actually, some of the studies are showing that, yes, increased time on social media can lead to depression, but upward social comparisons are actually the really damaging and more negatively impactful aspect of social media use. Now, what do I mean by an upward social comparison? That's when we go on social media, we look at others, and we compare ourselves to them, and especially when we look at others who we perceive as doing better than we are or having it all together. I think we've all experienced that. Can go on social media and constantly be feeling like we're not as good or we're not good enough. So even more so than limiting your time on social media, it's really important to learn how to diagnose these upward social comparisons, to be able to stop yourself in your tracks and say, wait a minute, what is the benefit to comparing myself to this person, and is this a realistic comparison? I heard two sociologists recently talking about the keeping up with the Joneses phenomenon. Now, this is an evolutionary concept where our brains are wired this way, because for millions of years, it actually helped you to survive. If your neighbor knew a better way of planting crops, you'd better figure that out. If your neighbor knew better hunting grounds and was coming home with better meat, you better figure that out as well. Keeping up with your neighbor was almost a survival skill. So it's hardwired into our brains. Unfortunately, nowadays, the neighbor we're trying to keep up with is the one on the screen that we're looking at. It doesn't actually have any bearing on our life, but at the same time, it can give us that feeling of unrest, of unsettlement. I'm not doing enough. I'm not good enough. I'm not comparing to this neighbor. So we really need to learn to diagnose that upward comparison and to sort of stop ourselves in our tracks. And that's one of the most impactful things you can do on social media. A few more helpful tips. Turn off notifications. This way, when I'm going to go interact with social media, I'm only doing it on my terms. My phone is not constantly pinging me, trying to get my attention, trying to distract me from day-to-day life. If I want to engage in social media, I'm going to go in and see what's there. Use social media with intention. Those same upward social comparisons that we talked about, you can do the same thing deliberately. Go into social media to lift up others, to build them up, to provide support. If you do it with intention, you can sort of control the way it affects you. Like we said, we're going to learn how to diagnose upward comparison and just be conscious of that as we use social media. Blue wavelength light. This is a hot topic. Everyone talks about screens and how they affect our brains. There are some bright sides to blue wavelength light. Increased attention, focus, and mood. And then there's the dark side, suppressed melatonin production, altered circadian rhythms. This can lead to not only sleep loss, but things like depression, diabetes, and cardiovascular problems. Now, often the suggestions for limiting blue wavelength light exposure are things that seem a little bit draconian. You know, cut off your screen time 2 to 3 hours before bed. Imagine you're living in a little house on the prairie, things like that. I want to give you a little bit more of a practical solution to this. I call it switching to decaf, or scheduling a blue light filter on your screen. Going forward, I'm going to show some different options for how to implement these suggestions, and I'll contrast them with iOS and Android for the Apple and the Android users out there. And if you want access to this PowerPoint after the fact, I can share the link with you for some more resources for this. So how do we set up a blue light scheduled filter? On Apple, we're going to turn on night shift. There's a couple different ways to do that if you follow the links below. But basically what you're saying to your phone is, between certain hours, maybe 8 p.m. and 7 a.m., I want you to filter out the blue light on my screen. So that same blue light effect that we talked about will be filtered out, and it's in an automatic fashion. So you don't have to remember to go in and change it. You don't have to do it on a manual basis each time. It's just automatic. The one thing you do have to remember, though, is if someone sends you a photo and it's after 8 p.m. and you set up the blue light filter, remind yourself, okay, this person is not jaundiced. I've just adjusted the color on my phone. So we like to call this switching to decaf. After a certain hour, you wouldn't continue drinking caffeine all throughout the night. You shouldn't continue looking at a device that's emitting blue light throughout the night either. So that's a really simple proactive step that you can take that's maybe not quite as extreme as turning off your phone for hours at a time before bed. Minimizing screen time. This is a big ticket item. Screen time can be insidious. It can really creep in. We use screens for work. We're on our laptops. We attend presentations on television. We get home. We turn on the TV. Maybe we turn on our computer for some more leisure time things. But the phones are probably the biggest, guiltiest culprit. I think, like many people during the pandemic, the phone became a little bit of an escape. If I had a moment of anxiety or uncertainty or even a moment of happiness, our phones have all too often become our default choice of what we pick up, what we turn to in these moments if there's a lapse in attention, or maybe I have a moment of boredom, maybe I'm standing in line. There's a million opportunities to grab your phone, to engage with your phone, and to disengage from everything that's around you. So I'm going to talk about a few ways that you can manage this and be proactive about it that are actually built into the phones themselves. One of the things you want to do when you start managing your screen time is really identify which apps are your sort of security blanket. Is it social media applications? Maybe it's the stock market applications. Maybe it's a news application, things like that. Identify what your triggers are, so to speak, which apps you sort of tend to default to when you're bored or nervous or anxious or anything like that. And then you can set up some realistic expectations about their use. I don't want you to say to yourself, okay, I'm going to cut off all screen time altogether. Like any other maladaptive coping mechanism that we have to deal with it in a structured manner. So what we'll try to do is, A, identify the apps that we use a little bit too often, and B, set some realistic expectations. Maybe I want to say to myself, okay, I'm going to use Facebook for just 20 minutes a day, and then we can work down from there. Maybe for you, cutting down would be just an hour a day. So you want to gauge your current use and then set some realistic goals so you don't get discouraged. And then you can scale down or up in a measured fashion. One of the other things about monitoring your screen time is maybe there are applications you want to use more of. Maybe you want to spend more time on the Kindle app reading. Maybe you want to spend more time on a Headspace app doing some mindfulness activities. So in the same way you can limit your screen time and keep an eye on overuse, you can also motivate yourself by saying, hey, I did an hour of Headspace meditation this week. I'm really working towards something here. So, and you want to reward yourself for meeting your goals. Here's some links for how to minimize screen time. We've got a couple different options. Apple has a screen time and downtime feature, and you can actually set it by app or by category. You can say to Apple, I want to only spend a half hour a day on social media, and any apps that are classified under social media will be restricted or count toward that half hour. Or you can break it down by specific apps. And say, listen, I don't spend a ton of time on Instagram, but I really spend a lot of time on Facebook. So that's the one I want to focus on limiting. So if you follow these links and you explore some of these possibilities, There's some great ways to track how you're using screen time, and you can even get weekly progress updates. I took a vacation recently, and my phone announced at the end of the week, congratulations, your screen time was down 50% this past week, which I certainly felt like that was the case. And then with Android, they've got a great mode called Digital Wellbeing. And that's got a lot of the same abilities, focus mode where I can reduce notifications, limit the things that are distracting me, a dashboard of how much I'm using certain apps. So these are some great tools to limit your screen time and to do so in a way that's not really obtrusive. You know, the phone's sort of logging it in the background. Infection control. I sometimes shudder to think what is on the surface of my phone that I carry around with me all day through every meeting. It's the device I touch in between every doorknob. So I really want to impress upon you the importance of cleaning your phone. For Samsung, I want you to refer to the manufacturer's instructions. I'm sorry, for Samsung or Android or anything like that. But for Apple devices, you can clean them with 70% isopropyl alcohol or Clorox disinfecting wipes. Wipe gently. Our phones have a special coating on them that resists fingerprints. It's called an oleophobic coating. So you want to wipe your phone gently, and I want you to do it frequently. The phone is probably the highest touch surface we have that we clean the least. You should clean your phone just about as often as you clean your hands if possible, but especially at the end of the day, especially when you're moving from one environment to another. I've just left the grocery store. I've just left work to go home. Please, please, please clean your phone. One of the nice things about some of the smart technology, if you have an Apple Watch or a smartwatch, they can remind you of whether or not you're washing your hands long enough. Recently upgraded my Apple Watch and got some very humbling reminders that 20 seconds of washing your hands is probably a lot longer than most of us think it is. So another way that technology can promote wellness by sort of being a monitor for these activities that are easy to sort of speed up. Contactless payment systems is another one that I'm excited about. I'm going to see this photo here from the BMC cafeteria. They're actually offering some contactless payment options, which is a really great way to get through the line in the cafeteria quickly and to not have to hand your credit card back and forth between you and the cashier. I don't know if folks realize that we have this option in the cafeteria, but here are some guidelines for setting this up on the Apple and Android phones. I want you to look for this little symbol here anywhere you go. It means you can use contactless payment methodology. And this is just a great tool in general. At the grocery store, you don't have to get everything out. You can just tap your phone to the terminal and pay that way. Timers and reminders. This is one of my favorite ways to use my phone, and it's one of the ways in which it actually can reduce our stress and our cognitive load that we put on ourselves. Our lives are unbelievably detailed. We have a million things to remember. We have a constantly changing and shifting set of expectations put on us. So I talk about this quote from one of my favorite books. It's called Put Things in Front of the Door. And the author is David Allen, and he wrote a book called Getting Things Done, The Art of Stress-Free Productivity. Which sounds a little bit like an oxymoron, stress-free productivity. But at the very beginning of his book, he talks about a small study where folks were given a task to remember. They had to bring a folder with them the next day. And they had them do a couple different things. One set of participants put the folder next to their nightstand. Another set of participants put the folder near the door where they would leave in the morning. And then the third group actually put the folder in front of the door where they couldn't open it unless they actually picked up the folder. And that was the group where in tests of stress and things like that had the lowest level of stress. Why was that? Because they basically set it up so that they couldn't get the door open without picking up the folder. So you can actually use your smartphone to implement a similar approach. Because we have our phones on us constantly, we can utilize them to remind us of things that recur. For example, remind me every Wednesday at 8 p.m. to take the trash out. So take a little bit of that cognitive load off your brain so you can free up creativity, critical thinking, things like that. Simple day-to-day tasks. You put your laundry in the washing machine, remind me in an hour to switch my laundry. It sounds kind of silly, but the more things we can take off of our frontal lobes, our executive functioning, the more we free up our brain, the more we reduce our stress. Remember the important details. Remind me when I leave here, call Nate. This is probably something most people don't realize that their phones are capable of doing. Not just a time-sensitive reminder, but even a location-specific. Remind me when I get to Home Depot, pick up screws, things like that. I can talk to anyone in detail about setting this up or utilizing this. I've got some instructions on the next page, but this is a really powerful tool that our smartphones are capable of doing that can really take a load off of our mind. One of my favorite things that I found as well is using timers to promote sleep. We talked a little bit earlier about limiting screen time and minimizing blue light before bed. One of my favorite things to do to promote sleep during the pandemic, and just something I've done in my personal life, is to listen to an audiobook at night and use a sleep timer. Now, if you have an iPhone, you can set a timer so that when the timer finishes, whatever's playing will stop. I've been listening to The Martian by Andy Weir. I highly recommend it. But just setting a 15-minute timer with an audiobook playing for bed is just what I need to wind down. It's become part of my ritual. And I'm not staring at a screen, but giving myself just a little bit of something to focus on so that my thoughts don't run away with themselves, and I can just sort of ease off to sleep. Our bodies are really susceptible to rituals. So if we have rituals that promote sleep and we get those ingrained, they can become really powerful tools to prime the brain and say, okay, it's time for sleep. Here are some little shortcuts to how the reminders work on both Apple and Android. I've got some links embedded here. We'll send this list out afterward for anyone that's interested. Oh. All right, this is an important one, subtle but important. Out of sight, out of mind. This is something about smartphones and not even whether we're using them or not. This is some research from all the way back in 2012, 2013, so you can only imagine how much more relevant this issue has gotten and how much more urgent this issue has gotten. Some studies have been done about what having a phone visible does to human interaction and human relationships. I don't mean someone on their phone, just having a phone in the room visible affects and inhibits closeness, trust, empathy, and understanding. This is mind-boggling to me, but when you really start to think about it, it makes perfect sense. Phones have become an embedded part of our culture. They're an embedded part of our personal lives, and it signals to our brain when we see a phone that the person holding it or the person nearby may be distracted. They may have someone waiting for them. They may have a million other competing stimuli, and just seeing the smartphone primes your brain to say, this isn't necessarily a conversation that can have depth. I don't necessarily know if I can trust or have empathy. It inhibits understanding. So even having a smartphone visible, they did a really interesting diagram in the study where there's two chairs where the participants were sitting, and then number one on here is the smartphone. The two participants sitting in the chairs, just having the smartphone on the table had a decline in the quality of their conversation. So I've really taken this into my work life, taking it very seriously. You can notice the difference if you walk into a room and you're holding a smartphone in your hand, whether you're walking into a room to interact with staff or even with a patient, versus putting the phone in your pocket or putting it out of sight. Not only are you more engaged and present in the conversation, but the person in the conversation with you is going to be much more trusting, present, engaged, willing to share more detail. Very simple but effective tool if you're going to walk into a patient care setting or into a meeting or sit down for a serious, conversation. Put the phone away. Make it so that it's invisible. This is a very simple but very powerful tool that I want folks to take seriously and be cognizant of. So the presentation is not saying we need to eliminate smartphone use altogether, but there are certainly some strategies that we can use to limit how they affect us and how they affect our relationships. Conclusion. Technology is a powerful tool for both connection and disconnection. There are some simple steps we can take using that same technology to reduce the impact on our lives and our relationships. We need continued mindfulness about how we interact with our devices and with each other. And I'm confident that as the pandemic sort of comes to an end, as we move back to normal life, we're all going to find that personal, real relationships are incredibly fulfilling. They've been missing in our lives, that face-to-face contact. But just know that the screen time that we've developed and the increase in screen time over the course of the pandemic is certainly going to become a burden to overcome. So I wanted to give you some empowering tools to work toward that. I want to encourage you to stay connected, to stay real, to keep your phones out of sight in conversations, and to use some of the tools built in to limit their impact on our lives. Thanks very much. Some resources here for Apple and Android, and some references if anyone wants to review further.